We want to bring in another expert now, a public safety expert, Dr. Alex Dale Carmen, to just share some insights with us. How is it that an 18-year-old high school student can enter an elementary school with both a handgun and a rifle? I think that's a big question people are going to be asking today, Dr. Dale Carmen.
Yeah, good afternoon, and thanks for having me. Our hearts and prayers go with the victims' families this afternoon for this horrible act. I will tell you that, unfortunately, what we have seen in the past few hours develop out of this story has become more normative than an exception in our country. And, it really is a matter of being able to block access from these individuals to harm, innocent children at schools. And so I think in this particular case, at the presence of police officers or perhaps a security component at that school, it could have prevented that. I always hesitate to play Monday morning quarterbacking in these events, but what is clear to me is that in the end, prevention mechanisms should definitely be in place.
When you say prevention mechanisms, what in particular needs to be in place?
So in the academic field, and we've studied this for years, we use the concept of target hardening, which is the idea of making a target very difficult to access by a perpetrator. And that typically includes the presence of police officers, the presence of some sort of a scanning system that would allow for individuals with a weapon to be detected. At times we've even brought dogs to identify, potential perpetrators. At the presence of cameras, it's also helpful as well. My understanding is that this particular school did not have some of those prevention mechanisms in place.
One of the things that I've been trying to follow as I put together a timeline is what that time would have been like. How much time passed from the time that a shooter was on scene to when the scene was stabilized? And from your understanding, what can happen? How much of a priority is it to be able to shorten that time so that there's not something terrible happening for a long period of time?
So every second counts, right? So we think about these incidents from the standpoint of, we have plenty of time to kind of reflect and think about how to respond to the threat and this and that. Every second that passes, once that perpetrator has entered a building, and in this case a school, it means a person's life, right? So at this point, law enforcement is trained and retrained in order to respond to these incidents, in a matter of seconds, right? But obviously sometimes the challenge is to try to get a police officer to actually show up at the scene in a timely manner. So we do have those challenges in place, but obviously, that's why from our perspective, we often say the presence of that police officer at the school perhaps would have made a difference.
That is something Senator Cruz said earlier. He said that we need to have armed officers at these schools, that would be a deterrent to situations like these. Do you agree with that?
I do, and I also believe, and I've said this for years, that if we had some sort of a Marshall program at the schools, the way we did after 9/11 in the airline industry, where you would arm individuals that would not necessarily be overtly exposed to showing others that they're armed, but if the bad guys know that a teacher may be armed, an administrator may be armed, then obviously these would be individuals that have prior experience using weapons, perhaps former military, in some cases former police officers. It would actually help us deter some of this, but more importantly, respond to these incidents when these incidents take place. In the past, 5-6 years ago, these incidents were a quote-unquote anomaly, a historical event. Now they're becoming normative. And that is my concern, is that they will continue to take place until we do something about them.
Got it. And talk about the importance of, just the communication. Like you said, every second counts, and having some sort of mass communication system to alert teachers and, staff members so that they can protect students in situations like these.
Right. So the training that teachers should undergo, as well as, the administrators of the school, is imperative to the success of protecting lives, right? So what I mean by that is that once that communication has been sent out, whether it's in the form of text emails or even through a speaker. At that point, what should happen is the teacher should take, and it's almost like what we call muscle memory. The idea that the teacher will know exactly what to do, will take the steps to lock the classroom, to get everybody on the floor, and to follow all the necessary steps in order to be able to preserve life. But it has to be so instinctive that the teacher does not question himself or herself, does not have time to wonder, I wonder what's going on or if this is real, but rather react to it because every second does count.
This Uvalde community, one that we've talked about, very small, very tight-knit, and very unique, but also this could be any small town in Texas.
Sure.
And my question maybe to a public safety expert is, with this not being a large city, it's not an urban area, is there a minimum standard of safety that should be met, and is that something that wasn't there today?
Yeah, so I think geographic immunity does not take place in a lot of these circumstances. And the reason for that is because we often think that, that because it's a small town or because, resources are limited, that they're not going to have the problems or the issues that face the big cities. And what we find that indeed, they have the same threats as we saw today, even in a small community such as Uvalde. And frankly speaking, they're actually even more exposed because they don't have access to those resources that big cities have.
Dr. Del Carmen, we could talk about, prevention and what could have, should have been in place. Doesn't change the impact of what happened today, doesn't, lessen or impede the grief and pain and anguish that these families are feeling. What are next steps, for this community?
Yeah, there's going to be a great deal of healing, the community coming together, and more importantly, trying to understand the unexplainable, right? So people are going to be scratching their heads for years, wondering what if, and why did this person do what they did? And so ultimately, at the end of the day, it's really a matter of healing, but it does take time to do that. And in some cases, you now have 15 families that have lost a loved one. That this morning they woke up with the sense that it was going to be just a normal day. And now they're talking about where the funerals are going to take place. I mean, that is a horrific act that it's historical in nature, but it does remind us all that these threats are real and they're happening all around our communities, regardless of their size and their complexity.
You have the grief and loss of those who've been directly impacted, who lost loved ones, but then you have those students, staff members, teachers who were not harmed and who may be enduring survivor's guilt. Talk a bit about that as well.
Well, I think that it is common for people to sit back and wonder, I wonder if I would have, gone out there and done something about it. Maybe if I would have kept my kid from going to school, or if the teachers, I'm sure, are wondering if I would have gone out there and I would have prevented this person from happening, all the ifs and buts. But in the end, the reality is, no one gets up in the morning expecting these events from taking place on a daily basis or being part of their lives. We criminologists are trained to think that way 24/7, but the reality is most people that have a lifestyle that is not related to law enforcement or security don't think that way. And so all of a sudden they're faced with this horrific act and they question what they should have done, which is part of that grieving process, and especially because they put a great deal of burden on themselves, thinking that they could have prevented the act, when in fact, perhaps not.
And what goes through your mind as a public safety expert when you hear details about this suspect, an 18-year-old local high school student who literally walked into this elementary school with a handgun and a rifle, aimed it at 15 people, including 14 children, and shot them dead?
Yeah, so, obviously the person cannot be within the full scope mentally that a human being should be in order to not only kill somebody, but also kill children. It's as horrible as an act can get. And then in addition to that, the fact that he's probably became radicalized in some way. We don't know the specifics right now, but whether it's an ideology or a certain stance or simply a certain hatred towards someone, at that school, or that school must have meant something to this individual. for that person to have simply picked it, right? So, or someone at the school. But what we do know, however, is that this radicalization that people have, whether it's based on racism or based on ideologies or just based on the mere sheer hatred towards other people, is a concern in our country today. And we're going to sadly see a lot more of this as we continue to evolve as a society and not necessarily pay attention to what happens to these young people behind closed doors.
It seemed like, there was a bit of a lull during the height of the pandemic, and it just seems like at this stage we continue recently in great number to be reporting on, subway shooting and school shooting and mass shooting, and many occurring just a couple of weekends ago, like in rapid succession, and now this. What are you thinking about as we're moving away from the heightened stage of the pandemic and we're starting to see once again these mass shootings spike across the country?
Yeah, well, we had predicted that, and I specifically have said this now for 2.5 years, is because we knew that the pandemic and all of the changes that it brought with it, right, which is, people's, jobs and their livelihood, their place where they spend most of the time, and then all the grief that has come with it as well, along with the frustrations and the change of society. All of that added has become really a perfect storm for crime, right? So what we have been saying, we criminologists, for a couple of years now, is get ready, right? And then you add to that the defunding of the police movement, the fact that people don't want to go into law enforcement anymore. It's truly a perfect storm. And unfortunately, we're going to continue to see this until the tide turns, which I hope is sooner than later.
Now, Carmen, if you're a safety expert who would have to come to this area and see the people of Uvalde and put a plan in place for them to feel safe, or any other place with a school like in Uvalde, what would you put in place to make people feel safe?
I would basically, you would have to do a crime prevention survey of the entire area. You would have to then try to understand what the vulnerabilities are of the school as it relates to people coming into the school and the threats, whether they're within the school or from the outside of the school, and then begin to put in place what we criminologists have studied for years now, which is a crime prevention protocol that would allow for individuals to survive and perhaps not necessarily even be part of an event such as the one that took place today. But look, I hope that the country, not necessarily just Uvalde, but the country in general, just learns from this experience once again and says enough is enough, right? Now we have 14 children and one adult that will never return home. And that in itself is a high price to pay, for communities that unfortunately, look the other way when we start talking about security. Not to say that Uvalde is responsible for this, but I will tell you that this brings up a serious topic, which is, where are the priorities of cities today? Where are the priorities of the communities today as it relates to the safety of our children?
Well, we will be bringing you the response from that community, as we know that they're dealing with the worst day possible right now.
It is absolutely the worst day possible. Dr. Alex Dale Carmen, thank you so much for your time and for your expertise and the work that you do to keep our communities safe.